Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. In 1890, the massacre at Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota was cast in the American popular imagination as a point of no return for American Indian life. Not only did hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children die, but in a sense, so did Native American life itself. This idea that a once noble race was doomed to oblivion was cemented by the 1970 bestseller Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown. In today's episode, I'm talking with David Treuer, an anthropologist and author of the new book, The Heartbeat at Wounded Knee, and he himself is also an Ojibwe from the Leech Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota, who argues the exact opposite. What he's trying to do is say that American Indian history isn't just unmitigated tragedy. David and I talked about the story of Native American life in the last century, and the hardships but also the resilience. For example, how American Indian children were conscripted into government-run boarding schools in the early 20th century, and many were forced to speak English, wear uniforms, adopt English-sounding names, and abandon parts of their culture. But ironically, in this event, kids from different tribes met and mingled, and by the 1940s, these connections created vast networks of peoples from different tribes, many of them historically enemies, who became familiar with one another and even intermarried, and a sort of pan-Indian identity was forged. And in the 1940s, more than a third of the native adult male population served in World War II. Many Indian veterans used the GI Bill to go to college, enter industries around the country, and mix with the rest of America to an unprecedented degree. What David discusses and what we look at is about creating a narrative so that American Indians don't just see their own past, and American society at large doesn't see their past as just one of tragedy and something that needs to be remembered sadly, but as a story of resilience and one that has a future. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with David Treuer. David, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I'm really interested in the topic of your book, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. And to dive into this, there's something I want to ask you about. Something that you mentioned is that the 1890 massacre is seen as a watershed event. And I would like to understand what the conception was in the American popular imagination of American Indians before this event. Did manifest destiny solidify itself in the American consciousnness? Was there an idea that things were moving inevitably toward one direction, or was the viewpoint after Wounded Knee somehow changed? Was it changed dramatically, or was this seen as an inevitable moment in the American popular imagination?
In terms of the popular American imagination, I think that, the people's understandings of Native people and Native people's understandings of themselves were evolving, but you definitely hear notes, throughout the 19th century and also in the 18th century about Natives being a vanishing race, a doomed race, one that's necessarily going to fall like wheat before the scythe of civilization, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you heard that language a lot. In 1890 was the massacre at Wounded Knee, the official closing of the American frontier, the sense that manifest destiny had been achieved, the destiny had arrived, followed by Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier hypothesis delivered at the Columbian World Exposition, I think, in 1893. If I have the date correct. All of this worked hand in hand to strengthen this idea of an American Indian past and an American future.
Well, let's deconstruct and then reconstruct. So what is the standard view of Wounded Knee? And when you actually looked at the event, what do you think the popular understanding gets wrong about this historical event? And how do you see it actually happening?
Well, I mean, the standard modern interpretation of or understanding of Wounded Knee summed up pretty neatly by Dee Brown in the introduction to his book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. He says on the very first page something to the effect of, I'm focusing on the American West and particularly on the Plains Wars between 1850 and 1890, and I end my story at the massacre at Wounded Knee, where, quote, the culture and civilization of the American Indian was destroyed, full quote. I mean, end quote. Let me try that again. So he says where, I focus on the Plains Wars between 1850 and 1890, and I end at the massacre at Wounded Knee, where the culture and civilization of the American Indian was destroyed, period. And he may have said that on the first page of his book, but that's sort of the most widely held opinion about it. And when Wounded Knee is evoked, it's only evoked to draw attention to, and rightly so, American predation and depredations. But I think that event, like so many events in the past, is more than that. For instance, in the lead up to that massacre, when the government was getting increasingly worried about the growth of the ghost dance religion among Plains tribes and tribes throughout the West, they began sending troops and arms to the Indian Agency at Pine Ridge and other places. There's a military buildup, and the former Indian agent for the Great Sioux Reservation, a guy by the name of Valentine McGillicuddy, which is one of the best names ever.
Exactly.
He was writing letter after letter saying, do not send troops, do not send guns. The more troops and guns that you send here, the more likelihood there will be violence. This place has seen too much violence already. And who cares if these native people are practicing their religion? We don't get bent out of shape, and the Jehovah's Witnesses do the same. So don't worry about it. They should have the right to do this, and it's not going to be a big deal, and you should just let it go, and don't do this. And so in the moment of Wounded Knee, you had people who felt like something bad was going to happen and were working very hard to prevent it. And so it wasn't merely or only the government doing its worst. And in the aftermath of the massacre, some of the people in the army filed charges against soldiers and against their fellow members in the leadership. There was not a consensus that this was a great deed, even though over 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor for massacring women and children. So there wasn't consensus before that this should happen, and there certainly wasn't consensus after that it needed to happen or that it was good that it did. So those are things that are often left out of the record. And left out of the record, too, is to me the most poignant and important aspect of it, which is that more people survived than died, which is not to minimize what happened at Wounded Knee Creek in December of 1890, which was an awful, bloody massacre. But it is important to keep that in mind, and it's important to keep in mind also, and to hold close also, that a lot of Lakota people survived, and they survived to go on and build families and get married and convert to Christianity and not convert to Christianity and to go on living. And so the biggest assumption, or let me rephrase that, the message that gets played most often is that it was the end of everything. But I feel that although it may have been a low point, it was the start really of our modern existence. And it was the start in many ways of our attempts to control our own lives, and a point at which we redoubled our efforts, not just to be victims of history, but to be actors in our own stories.
And one other question before we get into your reconstruction of the story. Believe it or not, my audience is interested in historiography. Nothing I thought I would have expected, but just how does the sausage get made historically? And they get that when narratives like these are crafted, it has to do a lot more with the time that the narrative is crafted and not about the time itself that's under discussion. So Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee is written in the 1970s. I don't know Dee Brown's background, if he's actually a historian or if he's just a popular history writer. Why do you think this narrative took so much foothold? I mean, he's treating American Indian culture like it's the Russian aristocracy after the Russian Revolution. Some of them flee to France and they survive, but their culture is really shattered completely. But that's really how it's treated. And you're saying it's not. But why do you think this narrative took hold so much?
Well, there are lots of contextual reasons, and you're right to point out that history is not merely or only written by the victors, but it's also written in the context of their life experience and their time. Dee Brown was a librarian, I believe, and he knew the archives, and he brought a lot of archival work to bear on his book. He wasn't an amateur historian, which is how I would talk about myself, and we can get to that later, because I'm not trained as a historian. But the book was published in 1970 by a guy who knew his work and knew his research and knew how to write. And 1970 was the height of the counterculture movement. And there seemed to be so many things wrong with Western civilization, so-called. The Vietnam War, in the years after, of course, Watergate, and during that time, the Pentagon Papers. There were so many things so obviously wrong with not just the West, but with America and Western democracy. People were really keen on finding or thinking about alternatives to that. Hence, people's fascination with and fetishization of Indian from India philosophy and religion, and the fascination with American Indian philosophy, culture, and religion. And I think Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee was one of these books that was almost functioned as a counterfactual. What if we hadn't done this? What might we have now? What might we see? And so I think that was part of its appeal. But the problem was that we didn't need a counterfactual because Native people were alive, and if not entirely well, we were surviving, we were living, we were making history. Our tribes still existed, our cultures still existed. They were changing, of course, but those things always change. And we were acting. And that gets lost when you rely too much on that kind of storytelling.
All right. Well, take us through what you see happens from the late 19th, early 20th centuries, how you tried to understand the story of American Indians in the United States. And for you, this is not just an abstract scholarly subject, but also a personal one. So how did you put this story together?
In terms of how I made the thing, I guess I made it like the people whose lives are talking about in the book. I made it as best I could. I was really clear with myself that I wanted to write a book about American Indian life, not American Indian death. And that required a certain methodology, right? It required me to do historical research to be sure, but it also obligated me to go and talk to people. I remember talking to this one guy named Red Hall, a Blackfeet guy in Browning. He was in his mid 80s, and he was this fierce fiddle playing former cowboy who had the most amazing mind and amazing memory. And he went into the deep, deep history of Browning and whose house stood where and what color it was painted and all the, he had amazing recall. But when we sat down, he said, "Well, I'm not an expert in anything. I'm pretty good after 1934, but I'm just a." He didn't really have the words, but he was trying to say he's just a guy. And I said, "Look, I'm not interviewing you because you were tribal chairman. You weren't. I'm not talking to you because you're a student of history. You weren't, but you are an expert on what life was like for you in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, which is kind of a blank spot in the cognitive map of American Indian lives and experience." I said, "You're an expert in that stuff. And that's what I want to talk about. What life was like, how you got water, where you went, what jobs were open to you, what you and your wife did when you ran away together. All this, that's what I want to know." So my book required me to go into the written record. It required me to go out in the field and talk to people. And it also required me to look in myself because I wasn't just interested in writing a counter history. I didn't want alternative names and alternative dates. I didn't want to point people's attention to the things they might not have noticed but are really there. I wanted to write a counter narrative. I wanted to write a narrative, a story whose shape deviated and largely destroyed our reliance, deviated from and largely destroyed our reliance on the tragic mode. And to me, the opposite of tragedy is not hope. The opposite of tragedy is context, texture, and layering. Tragedy washes everything out. It flattens everything out, and it turns everything into either an emotion or a statistic. And what I'm trying to do is create a style and a structure and content that is mimetic of what I think of as what is mimetic of our experience, which is complex, rich, layered, often contradictory, sometimes difficult, but creative.